I find that a good number of people have these answers for suffering that I don't think are really answers, but they suffice at least in the short term. And then something happens and that pat answer doesn't seem to work anymore. Mm-hmm. And then what I will find is that people who believe in God and think there are reasons to believe in God, but don't have an answer to this question of suffering, what they'll do is they'll just play the mystery card in spades. Mm-hmm. They'll just say, whenever something bad comes, they'll just say, well, God's ways are not our ways. Who are we to understand the mind of God? And it sounds really pious and humble, but playing that mystery card in that scenario is a way to not have to rethink some of these fundamental ideas about God, omnipotence being one of them.
Well, hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Liminal Living Podcast, and I am Dr. Tom Rundell, your curator of conversations around here. Now, this podcast is for people who are going through dark nights or deconstructions, and they have questions, they have doubts, they have things that they're on their mind, and they're not sure where safe places are to ask these things or have conversations. Well, this is one of those places. So, welcome. Now, today, the conversation I've curated for you today is another Dr. Tom. Yeah, this is like fun. I'm Dr. Tom. He's Dr. Tom. Dr. Thomas Jay Oord, to be specific. He's a theologian, philosopher, and a scholar in lots of different studies. He's an award-winning author. He's written and edited more than 30 books. He directs a doctoral program at Northwind Theological Seminary, and he also runs the Center for Open and Relational Theology. He also speaks at institutions across the globe, and most recently he was featured in Theology Beer Camp with Tripp Fuller. He also runs a podcast called The Oort Shorts, and he's been featured on over 50 podcasts, so ours is now added to the list. And what he's known for is his research on love and open relational theology. And we don't really dive a lot into open and relational theology today, but we kind of skim the surface where we talk about the doctrine of omnipotence. Yes, the doctrine of omnipotence. You've probably heard since you were a kid that God is omnipotent, can do anything at all. But then you also have probably heard all the qualifications about what that means and doesn't mean. And he wrote a book called The Death of Omnipotence and the Birth of Amipotence, which he coined the word amipotence, and we talk about what that means. So I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation today. It gets so practical about what it means for God to not be omnipotent and what that does for our relationship to God in love. I think you're going to enjoy it. So I'm going to set you loose on this conversation with Dr. Thomas Jay Oord. Well, Tom, welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. I'm really excited to talk to another Dr. Tom, not just me. And this is kind of crazy. I've never interviewed another Tom before, so welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks for the invitation and the opportunity for a conversation.
Yeah, I've been following you for quite some time through just everything you've been teaching, writing, and posting on social feeds, and I like to bring the people who are saying the things that shape how I think. I like to bring those to the people who like to listen to this podcast. So it's good. One of the things I really enjoy about your social media feed, I mean, your theology is great. I love your books and your writings, but your photography, you go hiking through the, I'm going to mess it up again. Owyhees wilderness. Yeah. And you post the most stunning photography on your site. Like, when did you start taking these hikes and practicing photography, and why did you start doing them?
I started photography back when I was in high school, but I picked it up again in the early 2000s. I was a newspaper reporter for Science and Theology News. I took the job because they said they'd pay for me to go to any conference I wanted to in the world, as long as I wrote a little short story and took some photographs. Oh, wow. So they bought me a camera, and, I went to Russia, Australia, China, all kinds of places. And then when I moved to Idaho, I realized I really needed to get out and spend more time in nature for my mental health's sake, for just to get away from the job of being a professor, and started taking my camera with me, and the artistic side of me kind of kicked in, and yeah, the rest is history, I guess.
Wow, that's pretty cool. And just the photography, you have like this ability to frame something really well artistically, and you capture, whether it's goats on the side of a mountain or a cliff, or the sunrise, or just how you are able to frame something that you see, like brings an artistic perspective to things. And I think that your writing does that also. Like you know how
thanks.
to take like these huge concepts and then just put an artistic frame around it so that it's like, oh, now I can see what you're saying. That's pretty cool. So I like the two things are almost the same. I almost asked you, like, are you a better photographer or theologian? Because, like you're really good at both of them, and I couldn't figure out, but maybe they're the same thing,
Maybe so. I mean, I think of them as quite different, because one is about being an artist with words, the other is artist with, vision. But yeah, you've put your finger on something I haven't thought a lot about, and that is, in photography, it's about composition. In composition, you make decisions on what you're going to put in the frame, but more importantly, what you're going to leave out of that frame. Mm-hmm. And being a good writer, I think, especially if you're trying to explain new or difficult concepts, you need to have some kind of awareness of cutting out the unnecessary fluff or unnecessary technical words and explaining it in a way that most people can understand. So yeah, I hadn't thought like that. So thanks for sparking that insight.
Yeah. I think that art and philosophy and theology can go hand in hand. And I learned that from Thomas Merton, who was a poet and a photographer, and he wrote some really deep spiritual and theological works that have really helped shape my mind. But cool. One of his famous works is the only known photograph of God. I can't remember if that's exactly how it is, but it's this landscape picture. It's beautiful, and then it's an industrial crane hook hanging in the forefront. And the story behind that one was that he was walking and observing nature around him, and it didn't see the hook hanging, and he just clocked his head right on it. And he's like, "Oh, that's just like God, I'm just here in my world doing my thing, and God's here, and I didn't even know it." And bam, I hit my head and got my attention. So
I do this lecture on God and photography, and use photography to talk about various attributes of God, whether or not God can be known, all the kinds of big questions in theology through the lens of a photograph. For instance, to talk about what theologians sometimes call God's hiddenness, or in Latin, it's Deus absconditus. I have a picture of a fawn hidden in the grass, just to sort of spark some ideas about that. Also, I've thought a lot about why it is that in church services, often God is symbolized by smoke, kind of a spiritual kind of angle, and why wispy clouds suggest to me something like the Holy Spirit. Anyway, lots of things. That's a conversation for a whole nother time, I suppose.
Yeah, but those are fun conversations to have.
Yes.
Now, you are able to think deeply and broadly about a lot of complex things. But before we get into some of the stuff I'd like to know who you are a little bit more. What's the soil that you grew out of that brought you here to this place today?
I grew up in a little farming community in eastern Washington called Othello. Was born in that little town, graduated from high school. My mother was a part of the Pentecostal holiness movement. My father was in the Dutch Reformed movement, and church was at the center of our family life. We lived on a farm, although my dad was a part-time farmer and full-time teacher. And our lives revolved around, ministering in the church and the community, singing songs, being a part of youth groups, all that sort of stuff, conventions. I was the kind of person who took my faith very seriously. And by the time I was in college, I was sort of an evangelist. I was a part of Campus Crusade for Christ. I did a lot of street preaching. And then near the end of my college career, I took a course in philosophy of religion. And for the first time, really took seriously arguments from atheists, agnostics, people in other religious traditions, and came to think that the grounds I had for believing that there was a God were not good grounds, were not strong. And eventually gave up belief in God for a while. And I returned to belief in God based primarily on two big ideas. One, I wanted life to have ultimate meaning, and I didn't think that was possible if there wasn't some kind of ground of meaning that most people call God. And secondly, I knew that I ought to be a loving person, that everybody ought to be loving, that in some sense love was the answer. And that intuition didn't make good sense if there wasn't something like an ultimate lover that most people call God. And from that sort of basis, I slowly started adding to my theology. I sort of wiped the slate clean, started with some really basic things, and kind of have added things on over the years. And I think I think of it as an advantage of that process, is that I'm probably more likely to set aside traditional beliefs if I don't think they make sense. So I'm not nearly as committed to, whatever orthodoxy is supposed to be, or whatever the tradition has said, whatever Thomas Aquinas thought, whatever. I'm more interested in having a theology that I think makes sense, not just logically, but experientially, that fits what I think is the majority or dominant themes of Scripture, but also meshes well with science. So that's a different perspective than I think many people have who are in theology.
Yeah, that wiping the slate clean and starting over, I think, gives you the advantage to write some of the things that you have been writing. Now, going back, what was it about that philosophy of religion class that really kind of rocked your thinking around God?
Yeah, well, I was taking some philosophy courses prior to that, and I had come to the place where I thought, well, this whole certainty thing, I can't be certain about God, but boy, I've got slam dunk arguments. I may not be 100% certain these arguments are correct, but I don't know of any really great rejoinders to them. And then I read some good rejoinders. I read some people who were smarter than I was and had some really good insights that opposed what I thought was true. Things about, God being a designer. That seems really obvious to me. In fact, I still believe God is building and creating a beautiful place. But the problem of evil places into question how beautiful this world is and our lives are. And so that was an issue for me. Another one was what we in philosophy call the first cause argument. I just thought it was obvious that God had to be the one who started everything at the beginning. And then I got to thinking, well, there's nothing illogical with thinking there's an eternal world. Why not go that route? And so things like that, these were real intellectual arguments and issues that I was dealing with. I think I think of my journey as kind of weird, in that most people I know who are atheists, who come from the kind of background I've been a part of and then become an atheist, they usually do so for reasons related to maybe they've been abused, or maybe they've had someone in their church that they trusted, like a youth pastor who did something immoral and they, kind of gave up on church, or maybe they just got so sick of the rules they wanted to live a freer life or whatever. But none of those things were that big a deal in my life. For me, it really was an intellectual quest.
Yeah, I kind of grew up in that your discipleship was, here's the questions that you're allowed to ask. Here's the answers to those questions. And here's all the arguments that back that up. Anything outside of that is just not worth your time.
Yep.
And,
That's kind of the way a lot of people do apologetics today.
Yes.
And which I think apologetics has a bad name because of that.
Yeah. And I know the apologetics discipline is much broader than what I was brought up with, but I don't like that word at all because of that. It's just, you're just going to give me a little swash of reality and say it's the whole pie, and then try and argue from that one place. And I remember I was listening to Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he was talking about intelligent design. And, I grew up in this young earth creationist with all of the arguments that back that up. And here's, a few scientific things that we think, prove that. But he just blew out this whole intelligent design out of the water with, everyone's saying that everything's so finely tuned and so this and that. And if the earth was just this way or that way, no life was. So it proves there's an intelligent design. And he said, for me, that just proves it took a long time to get here. And he did the age of the universe thing, which at the time it was 13.5 billion. Now it's more like 27.5 billion. If the James Webb telescope is correct. But he said 13.5 billion, years. And we have the last little sliver of time, maybe like the first few atoms of a blade of grass of time, if we're looking at a football field of time. He's like, that's when life could happen. So why did that intelligent designer waste all of these years trying to get everything to work? He's like, it just doesn't prove intelligent design to me. It proves that it just took forever for life to actually have any kind of conditions where it would work here. And I was like, wow, how come nobody ever explained it that way to me? They're just like, no, intelligent design, and here it is, and it's young earth, and it's this, and here's the questions, here's the answers, and you're good to go. Man, you would have blown me out of the water. Oh, yeah, sure.
I want to speculate why no one ever told you that.
Okay.
I want to speculate using my own life as an example, why people didn't tell me that, or maybe they tried and I wasn't interested. But, when I was younger and really a hardcore evangelist, the afterlife was the only thing that really mattered.
Yeah.
Going to heaven for eternity and avoiding hell. I mean, this life was a blink of an eye, said the preachers. And the only thing that mattered was that afterlife, and who wanted to be in fiery pain. Exactly. So the goal was to convince everybody to say the sinner's prayer, to give their life to Jesus, whatever phrase you like. Mm-hmm. And therefore it was all about, bringing your evidence and ammunition to win the argument, to convince people to say yes to Jesus. Mm-hmm. It wasn't about looking at at least carefully at the other arguments, unless you were just trying to figure out how to, answer them or overcome them. Yeah. So at least in my life, I wasn't listening carefully or even knew about the kind of argument you offered. I was thinking more about getting ammunition to defend what I thought was the absolute truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it turns out that the more I studied, the more I learned. And this is why I think conservative Christianity has a problem with ongoing education, is that the more I studied and the more I learned I didn't know. And the more questions I came up with that didn't have answers. And then all of a sudden things started to unravel for me, where I have questions and I have experiences. And, this framework that I had that I called reality was just so small. And then you start learning how, I kind of say it's like I was given a room to live in and told this is reality. And then one day, through education and experience, someone opened a window and I was like, wait, there's an outside? Wow, it's bigger out here.
Yeah.
Now, that sounds like a major turning point. What were the things you said you were just struggling to find meaning in that atheistic realm. What were the things that kind of brought you back around, and what kind of meanings did you find or answers did you find that said, maybe I do need to rethink this?
Well, I think at the time it was mostly at the intuitive level, the intuition that life should have meaning and that I should be a loving person. I hadn't really worked out the details. That took a while for me to work through. I now think that it's hard to be an intellectually consistent atheist because of the way we all end up living our lives. I'm not saying atheists are dumb. I'm not saying anything like that. I know some very smart atheists, some of my good friends. But if we all live as if morality and values are important, if we all live as if there's such a difference between better and worse, then the question becomes, where does that come from? And, today I think probably the strongest alternative to theism is something like evolutionary biology. But, and while I affirm evolutionary biology, I don't think it alone can give us that answer. Mm-hmm. So I, as an individual who wanted life to have meaning and purpose, and found myself acting and expecting things from others in terms of morals and values and purpose, I thought, well, if I'm going to expect that from myself and others, sure, I might as well have a good framework to make sense of all that. And a theistic framework provided that. Again, it was a very thin one, mm-hmm. Which was probably good in one sense, because some of the theistic frameworks do a great job of giving a basis for values and purpose, but they have a vision of God that presents all kinds of other problems, especially, I'm sure we'll talk about omnipotence. Most people think of God as omnipotent, but if you have that view and you're trying to answer questions of value, then, the problem of evil is going to arise. So at least initially, I had a very thin theism that I was working with.
Yeah. You mentioned evolutionary biology, and I think a lot of the theologies that we hold were for like that medieval imagination. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We have these outdated theologies that we're holding on to them because we have always held, they're the creeds, they're the things that we must hold, they're the truths, and these are our mm-hmm. anchors. But a lot of the minds that came up with the creeds and the things that we're supposed to do, doctrines and whatnot, they're coming from this medieval theology. And, mm-hmm. Right around, 1400, we have this Copernican revolution where it says, the earth is not the center of the universe. Humanity's not the center of things. And fundamentalists, it feels like fundamentalists want to freeze our minds in this place and say, don't change and don't think beyond the confines of this. But you are thinking like modern thoughts for a modern age, one that's taking into effect, like we're not the center of the universe. And, evolutionary biology explains many things. And one of the theologies that you're rethinking is the omnipotence of God. Why is this one so important to rethink? And why did that one really land in your zone where I'm going to really write a lot about this?
Yeah. Initially, and still today, but especially initially, omnipotence seemed to conflict with my commitments to love. So I told my story that love was at the center of my return to God. I wanted to believe that I should be a loving person and that there was a perfect lover who was empowering and inspiring me to love. Well, if this perfect lover was active in the world, was omnipotent, then the question arose, well, why doesn't this perfect lover stop the horrific evils of my life or in the world? I mean, after all, if I read the Bible correctly, God is often asking me to do what I can do to stop or prevent evil. why doesn't God just up and do it single-handedly if God is omnipotent? And so I was seeing the tension that many, many, many theists have seen between a God of perfect and ultimate power and love and the evil in the world. And as I began to probe that, I initially drew on the tradition that I had been raised in, which is the Church of the Nazarene, a Wesleyan tradition that has a great emphasis upon free will. And for a while, I thought the free will defense could give me an answer. You know, God doesn't stop evil because God gives free will, and so we should blame creatures. And there's partial truth to that, but the problem with that, there's a couple of them at least. One is that the free will defense doesn't give us a good answer for what we usually call natural evils. You know, like, why didn't God stop the pandemic? And it doesn't seem like anybody's misusing their free will on that one, or a tornado, or, you know, genetic defect or random genetic mutations. And then the other issue was I realized that if God was giving free will and doing so in a kind of voluntary kind of way, then I could imagine scenarios in which it would seem to be loving not to give free will. In fact, if I had the capacity to thwart someone's free will, there might be instances in which that would be the most loving thing to do. My favorite example of this is to say, you know, if my 3 daughters are playing in the creek behind my house here in Idaho, and one of my daughters tries to drown one of the others by sticking her head in the water, if I'm close enough to go out there and rescue her and interrupt my one daughter's free will to save the other, isn't that a loving thing to do? Well, I think it is. And yet God, who seems to, according to omnipotence, be able to do anything, God's not doing that very often, if ever. And so that was kind of the initial reason I started to question omnipotence.
And so that was it more of an intellectual problem that you're trying to resolve in your head? Are there circumstances around you, or was it like a mixture of the two?
Yeah, it was a mixture of the two. You know, I knew theoretically about questions of evil, like, you know, the Holocaust. Why didn't God stop the Holocaust? I wasn't there. I don't really think I know anybody who was there, but obviously that's a horrific thing, and that's a big question. But then there were people in my own life who were dying or who had bad things happen to them. And so that was on a more personal level. Why didn't God prevent my friend Jay from driving his car off the road and dying? Why didn't God prevent my best friend's mother from getting cancer? That kind of thing.
I think like that old framework, it doesn't make sense to life's experience, but we don't know that we can question something as foundational to our understanding as omnipotence. And you just took a book, and it's the Death of Omnipotence, the Birth of, let me get this word right, Amipotence.
Amipotence, yeah.
Amipotence. And I read that book over the weekend, and it's just such a solid argument that I would have never, ever thought I was allowed to even say, you know, God is not omnipotent, because that would be like saying, you know, something as solid as like Jesus is not God. I was like, wait, we just can't go there because that's my foundational framework here. But you went there with this, God is not omnipotent, and then you wrote this book that's very potent. I mean, the audiobook that you read was maybe almost 6 hours, but there was so much potency in there, and you take in like every question and every doubt, and you explain every angle and every side. I was just so surprised at the exhaustive amount of work that went into thinking this through in an intelligent way. And it's just such a good work.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you saying that, Tom. Yeah. I'm the kind of person who, even though I'm very eclectic in terms of who I draw from, like my influences. I'm also I care a lot about rationality and coherence. And so I want an argument that doesn't have a lot of loose ends.
Yeah.
And so that's just the kind of way I think.
Yeah. And it really felt like you're trying, like it was an act of love. Like, okay, if I question this, then these people over here are going to have all these questions. So I need to answer those. And then these people over here are going to have these objections and I need to address those. And like,
that's exactly how I think.
Yes. And it was an act. It wasn't a, like what I would think of as an apologetic, like I'm going to prove you all wrong. It was, I want to help you understand this. And,
that was the tone I was aiming for. The truth is, as much as I write books on a lot of different subjects, and I care about a lot of things, but what I care about most is living a life of love. And so I want a theology that makes sense of that quest to live a life of love, not just my own living in love, but a God. If there is a God, which I think there's plausible reasons to think there is, that God seems to me to be the ultimate lover. And so I want a coherent theology that makes sense of my experience, that people can understand.
Yeah, I think you don't know you have bad theology until you're in the midst of a situation that calls it into question,
Yeah.
And that's suffering. It's like suffering pulls off the insulation of that you're like insulated from reality with these ideas about what you think is true. And you don't have to question those ideas until you're missing that insulation. Suffering is one of the things that just exposes us to life like as it really is, not the ideas, not the concepts, but like raw experience. And like that there is when people start, like your theology starts to go off the rails when like I am experiencing something that my theology cannot address or explain. And most people don't know that they're allowed to have these questions and doubts and wrestle with it. And so they either silently don't try not to think about it or they leave. And you just give this third path that I just thought was really good.
That's a good way to think about it. I wrote a book that came out in 2019 with the provocative title, God Can't: How to Believe in God and Love After Tragedy, Abuse, and Other Evils. And the response that I got to that book, was actually a lot more positive than I thought it would be, given that title. But there were three kinds of people who I found really loved that book. And the first kind was the biggest group, and that's the group you've been describing. That's the group who has really suffered genuine harm. Most of them floated along with a kind of a traditional view of God, and then something horrible happened to them. Their kid died, or they were raped, or they had some tragic accident, and that then upended the status quo for them. It upended their typical ways of thinking about God. And then I come along with God Can't, and they go, that makes so much better sense. Other people like it are people I think of as at the margins of society, people who know that there's something wrong with the way things are because they're outside and looking in, and they can't imagine that God set things up to put them in this bad position. So I come along and say God isn't controlling things, isn't setting it all up. That is reassuring to them. And then the third group of people are people who just have big questions. I call them the theology nerds, people who have been asking questions and looking for better answers, and they'll stumble on my book, and many of them find it helpful.
Yeah. Somebody who helped me rethink theology is my son. He's going to be 20 in January. He's disabled, kind of globally disabled. He was born with a genetic anomaly that doesn't really have a syndrome name, but it's affected him just globally everywhere. And when he was younger, I remember laying in his bed and I'm trying to be the good Christian pastor dad kind of a thing with him and talking to him about God. And just trying to encourage him, like, God made you perfect. God made you perfect. And he just looked at me and with a moment of like rare clarity, he just said, no, he didn't. I'm like, what do you mean? Well, what part of you did he is not perfect? And he just like pointed to himself, like, this part of my body. And he was experiencing stomach and digestion issues. So he just pointed right at his stomach. He's like, God didn't make that right.
Yeah.
And that was like truth coming from the mouth of babes at that moment, point. It's like,
yeah.
And it just like rocked me. Like, he doesn't have the intellectual constructs that I have built, that I'm almost like lashed to him because I have to be a pastor and I have to be, this good Christian person, dad, whatever. He doesn't have all that. He just knows what he knows and loves what he loves. And, from this very childlike place is like, oh no, like, God didn't make me perfect. What are you talking about? And I just, that'll stick with me forever. And
that's a beautiful story. I find that a good number of people have these answers for suffering that I don't think are really answers, but they suffice, at least in the short term. God's got a plan for this, or God wanted it this way for a higher purpose, or God is punishing you, or character is going to be built through what happens. Mm-hmm. And then something happens and that pat answer doesn't seem to work anymore. Mm-hmm. And then what I will find is that people who believe in God and think there are reasons to believe in God, but don't have an answer to this question of suffering, what they'll do is they'll just play the mystery card in spades. Mm-hmm. They'll just say, whenever something bad comes, they'll just say, well, God's ways are not our ways. Who are we to understand the mind of God? And it sounds really pious mm-hmm. and humble, because of course no one can understand God perfectly, right? Mm-hmm. I don't want to come across as saying I've got God all figured out, but playing that mystery card in that scenario is a way to not have to rethink some of these fundamental ideas about God, omnipotence being one of them. Yeah. And so the mystery card becomes an out rather than a beckoning call to go deeper into thinking about God in new ways. Yeah. And I'm trying to coax people into that last alternative. Rethink your fundamental views about God.
Yeah. And it's really inhospitable to people in suffering to play the mystery card, because it tells them your questions don't matter. Your experiences don't matter. Just blindly trust, which is easy for me from my perspective, because my life's going great. And I'll just hand you this. I've resolved my anxiety about your event, and I get to move on with my life, and you get to go and, keep on suffering. And I feel like I've done my duty. And I just think it's so inhospitable to do.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah.
Cliches. You pull out those cliches to write off your own anxiety when people bring you tremendous problems. And your book doesn't cliche anything away. It just hits it right head on. I just thought it was a real good work for that.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah. Now, I'd like to get into some of your ideas. How would you define omnipotence? And then how would you define amipotence, and kind of talk around those concepts from your book?
Yeah. Well, since this book is rejecting omnipotence, the title is The Death of Omnipotence. Yes. I wanted to be clear about what I meant by the word. Yes. And so I offer 3 different meanings, all of which I reject. These are meanings not that I made up, but I go to the major thinkers in the Christian tradition, people like Augustine, Aquinas, John Calvin, etc. And so the 3 major ways of thinking about omnipotence is God is omnipotent in the sense that God can do anything. God is omnipotent in the sense that God exerts all power whatsoever. And God is omnipotent in the sense that God can control anyone or anything. Now let's take that last one. God can control anyone or anything. A lot of people who have that view don't think God exerts all power. They reject the second view of omnipotence that I propose, but they think that God, gives free will most of the time, but occasionally, if it's really important, God will unilaterally or single-handedly decide some situation or some outcome. And that's a control in the sense that I'm using that word control. So I want to reject all three of those views, even though all three are prominent in not only the Christian tradition, but also in major Muslim and Jewish scholars.
Yeah, it was, you used a reference from The Simpsons that just made me, I was chuckling in the kitchen as I'm cooking dinner. And you quoted Homer Simpson that, can God heat up a microwave burrito so hot that even he can't eat it?
Yeah, some of these are issues that major theologians, not necessarily issues related to Simpsons, but issues of logic and things that major theologians have wrestled with for millennia. The idea that they would say God is omnipotent, but God can't make 1 + 1 = 77, or God can't make a married bachelor, or, these kinds of logical contradictions. Just about every major theologian will make a qualification to omnipotence in this kind of way, in terms of logic. And then there's other ones, other qualifications that they'll make. For instance, they'll say, God can do anything, but God can't lie. And the reason God can't lie is because God is truthful all the time, and that would go against God's nature. Or they'll say God can do anything, but God can't stop existing because God exists necessarily. And then in one of the chapters, I just sort of catalog instance after instance of things God can't do, making the point that if you qualify omnipotence so often and in so many ways, its value, its meaning as a word seems to slip through your fingers.
Yeah, and all of those different qualifications, like you're just going through a whole list of, and then you called it, what I think you said the words, the omnipotence of God dies a death of 1,000 qualifications.
Yes, yeah.
Because I've never thought about that, but you say, oh, God can do anything. He's powerful. He's all powerful and omnipotent. And then you get into all the things that God can't do, like lie or cease to exist, or, make 1 + 1 = 7. And it's like, oh, so what? It almost cheapens omnipotence to not even be omnipotence in the first place.
Right. And these are not just things that philosophers are throwing at people. I quote scripture quite a bit. God can't deny himself, according to Timothy. God can't be tempted, according to James. God can't grow tired, according to the psalmist, et cetera, et cetera. And so these, some people might say, well, the problem is you're just relying too much on philosophy. Well, scripture itself has posed these problems, and if we're going to take scripture seriously, we need to work through them.
Now, you kind of coined this word amipotence. What does that mean? Can you give us some ideas around that?
Yeah, let me set up the meaning of it by giving you a little bit of the reason why I wanted to write a chapter and talk about amipotence. I mentioned earlier that I wrote a book called God Can't, and that a lot of people found it helpful. But I found that people thought they really had to choose when it comes to God between two options. Either God was doing everything, controlling everything, or God was doing nothing. God was, either up on Mars eating popcorn, or God was like the glue of the universe, not really interacting, but just kind of like the Force in Star Wars or something. And I believe God is very powerful. I use the word maximally powerful, but I don't think God is able to control anyone or anything. And so since I'm rejecting omnipotence, I wanted to offer an alternative word that tries to capture what I think God's power is like. So I invented a word. I invented this word amipotence. A-M-I is the Latin for love. We find it in words like amigo or amicable. And then potence is the word for influence or power in Latin. So the idea of omnipotence is God's power is the power of uncontrolling love.
Yeah, that whole idea between power and love or power has to be subservient to love, like that really reshapes how you see God when you see that God's love is the primary understanding way for understanding God, not God's power. Because when you say God's all powerful and then you say God is love, it almost feels like God is love is like a little side thing where John is saying, no, the nature, identity, God is love. And then we make God into, no, actually God is power and God has love. And you're reversing those and saying, no, God is love and God has maximal power. But it's limited. Yeah, it's limited in what it can do because love will only do certain things.
Right. It's exactly it, man. You've explained it perfectly. I think lots of theologians have seen the problem of starting with God's power and then adding love later. You end up having a view of God that sounds very controlling. It's hard to have a real relationship with someone who's going to control you all the time. Mm-hmm. And so what some famous theologians have tried to do is to say, well, power doesn't come first. Rather, all of the attributes are of equal value. Love is just as important as power, power just as important as love. And that sounds all nice and dandy until you actually look at the way they put out their theology and what they say God is all about. And then time and time again, what they're really doing is privileging God's power above God's love. Mm-hmm. Let me give you an example. Mm-hmm. Lots of theologians think God can decide not to love us, not to love any. God is choosing to be in love with us or to love us. Well, that means that God has the power to love us, which is putting power before love. And I could give other examples. What I'm doing, as you rightly point out, is saying, nope, let's start with love. Mm-hmm. God's got to love. It's God's very nature. And then whatever we want to say about God's power, and I want to say a lot of things, it can't contradict this all-encompassing, all-embracing love of God.
Yeah, if you look throughout church history, you can see how this view of God being omnipotent, all-powerful, then gives authority to people in power in the church to exercise power as they see fit.
Right.
And, we have, people being burned at the stake for being a heretic. They have the wrong information in their heads, or the Crusades or the Inquisitions and it just goes on. And it feels like as a society today, we're really like deconstructing power out of the church and saying we're done with, we're post-Christian society now. So we can actually do this where we are done with you abusing your power in these ways. And the Christians are like just doubling down, at least the evangelical American Christians are just doubling down on their power stances. Somebody shared a clip of Mark Driscoll today, like he's still preaching, he's got a church of a couple of thousand members, and he was calling red letter Christians demonic and apostates.
Oh, it sounds so much like Mark.
I was like, wait a second. So these Christians who are trying to live the way of Jesus according to the words of Jesus are demonic because they reject your understanding of power. It just boggled my mind, but here we are. The power has infected the church so much to where people are just walking away and saying, no, thank you, I'm done. Too much abuse.
Yeah, and I think we see it in obvious ways with someone like Mark Driscoll, who I think of as like the Howard Stern of popular preachers. But it's more subtle in more mainstream people or mainstream religion. And that is, if you think God is omnipotent, which 90+% of Christians I know think that, and you think omnipotence means that God either causes or at least allows who's ever in power, then you have to say God wanted Trump to be in the White House. God wanted Joe Biden to be president. It's God's will. God ordained it, either because God, unilaterally or single-handedly made it happen by, that free will and voting isn't a real thing, but God actually does it all, or God could have changed the balloting so that Trump wins or Biden wins or somebody wins, but God is allowing that person to be in power. And God allowing it to be in power means that in some sense it's God's will. Lots of moderate to progressive Christians I know think God is omnipotent, but they'll say, oh, no, God doesn't choose, God doesn't decide who's going to be elected. But the logic of omnipotence says that God either causes or allows it. And so I want to say to those people, give up on omnipotence. There's a better way to think if you start with God's love. You don't have to think that God does nothing. This isn't the God of deism. This isn't a do-nothing God, but it is not a controlling God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's so many people who have walked through tragedy and suffering, and they end up confused. And I remember, we lost an infant son back in 2005. And that's when I started to really wrestle with, well, if God could, but didn't, I don't want to play the mystery card. I didn't have an answer. I didn't have a framework for this.
Yep.
And I just became, and I'm a pastor at the time, but I just became really cold towards God. Yeah. Because I felt like God did this. And for 2 years, my only prayer, even as a pastor in a church, was, God, you're going to do whatever the hell you're going to do, so I'll just try and stay out of your way. That was the best prayer I could do for 2 years. Yeah. Because I was just so mad, and I didn't have a framework for understanding, like, okay, if, I heard this testimony over here about how God miraculously healed, Nancy over whatever, and then I have my situation, and I didn't. And the church only displays the miraculous. It only displays the victory stories. Now, those are the testimonies. But what about the people who lost their son, lost their child, lost their, their jobs or their careers or businesses, and God didn't swoop in to rescue? Like, why aren't we talking with them and giving them a framework for understanding God? And I think your book does that.
Oh, thanks. Well, and this is, according to the testimonials I've read and heard firsthand, it's some version of the problem of evil that's leading so many people who are Christians to deconstruct, to say, this framework doesn't make sense. Yeah. The way I've been taught about God no longer fits my experience. And actually, I'm in the midst of co-writing a book called God After Deconstruction, where we're going to propose the kind of way that I outline in this Death of Omnipotence book for thinking about God after you've seen the problems with the conventional God.
That'll be good. We got to have you back on here.
I'd love that.
Yeah. So when this podcast comes out, Advent will have started, and Advent kind of looks towards this incarnation of God in human form in the person of Christ. And there's like this the Philippians 2 passage where Christ gives up that power of God to become a human. It seems like we would have, at least within the framework that of Jesus, we would be at least more comfortable talking about at least a self-limiting love of God, let alone questioning an omnipotence, because we have at the center core of our theology the incarnation, where God becomes human in the person of Christ and doesn't cheat and claim a God card and do anything. It just does everything as a human would. But there's one question that I did have. When the love of Christ overcomes death and the resurrection, then there's this great commission moment where Christ says, now all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth, and then commissions the disciples to go. How does the Great Commission fit into your framework of amipotence? is there a difference between authority and power or something along those lines?
Yeah, I think a person can have authority and yet be unable to control.
Okay.
I think a person can give commands and yet be unable to control what other people do. I know this as a father. I commanded my daughters to be in at midnight, and sometimes they did not come in. So just because I was the authority in the house and gave these commands, it didn't mean that I took away the free will of those who I was commanding. And I think that's the same with God. It's the same with Jesus.
Yeah.
So just because there's authority there, it means authority doesn't mean control. It means the kind of a dignity that we should subscribe to someone who is in some sense superior. I think superior because of love, but in some sense superior, and therefore we look up to that person to give meaning, to give purpose, to give direction in our lives.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking it. Yeah.
I'd like to actually talk a little bit about incarnation in a way that probably will surprise a bunch of your listeners.
All right, let's do it.
Let me start off by saying a really shocking thing, at least for some people.
My favorite kind.
Jesus was not the incarnation of God in the world.
Talk more about
that. And the word that I want to emphasize in that phrase, Jesus was not the incarnation of God in the world, is the smallest one in that phrase. The word "the." Jesus was not the incarnation of God in the world. I think God has always been incarnate, everlastingly been incarnate in creation. God's present in every single moment of every single thing that exists as an influence in that thing's existence. God isn't the same as the world. I'm not a pantheist, but I think God is always present, incarnate in the sense of being in the flesh. And here I'm extending flesh to even down to the atoms. So it's not just, beating red meat or something like that.
Right.
So I think God has always been around and always will be around because God is directly present and indwelling everything that exists. So when it comes to Advent season, I always cringe when I'm in church and the pastor says, God decided to come to earth in the form of Jesus. Because I think most people in the audience think, well, God wasn't around before then, and then God decided to come. I think God's always been around. Mm-hmm. However, I do think we should celebrate Jesus as the clearest revelation of the incarnation of God in the world. In other words, we don't have to think that Jesus is just like a worm in terms of revealing who God is in the world. We can say that Jesus of Nazareth responds to the call of God moment by moment in his life and reveals to us who God is, God's love especially, but other attributes of God in a way that no one has equaled before or since, and is therefore unique in that way. And so it's just fine and dandy to celebrate Jesus at Advent. I just want to say, I'd like us to emphasize God always being with us and not just once in a while flying in from outer space in the form of Jesus. Actually, what I really don't like also, since I'm on my pet peeve going here, the first Sunday of Advent is a celebration of Jesus's return. And I was raised thinking that one day I was going to walk outside and look up and there was going to be Jesus on a chariot with a bunch of other people on horses. Mm-hmm. And they were going to be flying through the air and they were going to come down and take away at least the good people. And well, I don't know about the bad. Either they had to stay here and, figure out they'd been left behind or they were going to hell or something. But anyway, I always thought like, we're on our own until Jesus comes back. But I have a real problem with that if God is always present with us. So whatever it means for the return of Jesus, it can't mean, as I think of it, that God is not with us right now. I think it's got to be something to do with some kind of victory of good over evil or love winning or something like that, because I think God's always with us.
Yeah. I've got a mini pet peeve right now.
Okay.
Since we're on pet peeves, we always picture angels with chariots and horses and swords and shields. And like, when that was written, that was the high-tech stuff of the day. So
Right.
Did they just get stuck in the Bronze Age? Or are they driving tanks and like fighter planes with M16s now? That's what I want to know.
Yeah, there you go. Or if God is a God of love and they're God's messengers, are they not doing any of that military crap?
Hopefully, yeah.
Doing something else.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, the first Sunday of Advent, we observe the prophet's candle of hope. And I just want to know, there's a lot of stuff going on in our world today. There's a lot of war, there's a lot of arguing, and a lot of potential for evil can unfold, especially with, what's going on with Russia and Ukraine and Israel and Hamas. And, even in America here, we got Democrats and Republicans wanting to kill each other. And at the beginning of Advent, we light this candle of hope. What gives you hope for the church and humanity in the modern world today?
I want to answer that in a kind of a general way, all right?
Okay.
And let me start by saying something else that'll probably shock some people. If God is omnipotent, I have no hope.
That is shocking.
Because if God is omnipotent, that means God is either causing or allowing all the things that you mentioned, the wars, the tragedies, the pandemics, the fighting in political parties, the real life individual suffering, torture, sexual abuse that's going on. If God is omnipotent, man, I don't have much hope, because God's not rescuing when God is able to. And if God's not rescuing now, why should I think God's going to do it later? In fact, I don't want to spend eternity with a God who could have rescued us now, but is not doing so.
Mm-hmm.
However, if there is no God, I also don't have any hope. If there's no spirit of love at the very core of our lives and existence, prompting, prodding, calling, persuading, or my favorite word, wooing us toward what's better, not controlling us, not forcing us, but urging us to live in ways that are harmonious with ourselves and our planet. If there's not one of those gods around, then I'm hopeless. To me, hope is found in this real relationship between a loving, universal spirit of uncontrolling power in relation to creatures who are called to cooperate with that God. And sometimes we don't, and that sucks. And that's, painful. But sometimes we do. And that gives me hope. The notion that God doesn't give up, and it could be that we could all learn to say yes to that loving, universal spirit.
That's really good. And I love how you can just say something shocking and then explain it. And it's like, oh, yes.
Thanks, Tom.
Well, I think we've given folks a taste of what your book is like and what it's about. Where would you like to send people who want to go buy it?
Yeah, it's available on all your major online booksellers, Amazon, other places. It's an ebook and audiobook. So I think you listened to the audio. I apologize for having to listen to my voice for 6 hours, but
it was fine. It was good. It was good. And where if they want to connect with just some other socials, do you got any socials that you prefer people connect with you at?
Yeah, I'm a Facebook and Twitter person. I also have a personal website. That's my full name, Thomas Jay Oord, Jayoord is how you spell the end of that, .com. I also direct the Center for Open and Relational Theology, and there's some great resources there. And that web address is the letter C, the number 4, and then ORT.com.
C4O. Okay. Ort. I will put those.
C4 Ort.
I'll put those in the show notes when this one airs. Well, Thank you so much for just coming on and sharing your heart and your mind and your ideas and your story. It's been a ride.
Hey, I've enjoyed it.
Well, cool. We'll have you back for sure.
Great.
Well, thank you so much for listening in and tuning in for this first in our December series with Dr. Oord. It kind of blew up my brain a couple times. It was such a fun conversation to be able to take on something that I've just had so many questions about. And maybe you have, maybe you didn't know you had questions until you listened to this podcast and you're thinking, wow, that makes sense. Now, if that's you and you enjoyed this conversation and you would like to help us out, there's a couple things you can do. You can rate or subscribe. You can leave a review. You can share it with a friend. Put it on your Facebook and tag Liminal Living. I would love if you could get the word out about this podcast. Our audience is growing. I'm looking at my stats and they're going up and to the right, and I'm very happy about that. So next week we got some more great conversations. We have Dr. Chris Green coming up. We have Father Kenneth Tanner coming up, and then we have, to close season 2 and year number 2 out, we have a best of, where I'm asking all y'all, what has been your favorite moment in season 2? And if you have one of those, go ahead and drop me a message on Facebook through our Liminal Living Facebook page. Leave a comment. What episode was your favorite and why? And you could be featured on our season finale episode here at the end of the year. Well, blessings on you as you discover and explore more about what it means to be you and what it means to be here and what it means to be in this world. We will see you next week. Peace out.